5. A quorum being present, the Committee on Homeland Security will be in order. The committee is meeting today for consideration of H.R. 6825, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program Improvement Act of 2022, H.R. 6387, the School and Daycare Protection Act, H.R. 1540, the Reporting Efficiency to Proper Officials in Response to Terrorism Act of 2021, H.R. 6856, the Securing Air Travel Act, H.R. 6873, the Bombing Prevention Act of 2022, H.R. 6824, the President's Cup Cybersecurity Competition Act, H.R. 6868, the Cybersecurity Grants for Schools Act of 2022, H.R. 6826, the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism Pilot Program Act, H.R. 6827, the Securing the Checkpoint Property Screening System Act of 2022, H.R. 6871, the DHS Acquisition Reform Act, H.R. 6861, the Reducing DHS Acquisition Costs Growth Act, and H.R. 6837, the No TikTok on Department of Homeland Security Devices Act. Without objection, the chair is authorized to declare the committee in recess at any time. With that, I now recognize myself for an opening statement. At the outset, I'd like to express solidarity with the people of Ukraine and commend the Biden administration for bringing democracies together in Europe and beyond to hold Vladimir Putin accountable for forcibly invading Russia's democratic neighbor. We do not need to wait on history to put this attack in context. We know today that Putin's goal extends beyond gaining territory. He's determined to strike at the heart of democracy, and this time, unlike in the past, when he hid behind GRU cyber hackers or FSB assassins, he's doing it out in the open. As the chairman of the Committee on Homeland Security, it's not lost on me that the ramifications of Russia's invasion of Ukraine are already being felt here in our homeland. I stand ready to support the Biden administration and our allies in standing up for democracy and holding Vladimir Putin to account. Turning to today's agenda, we have 12 measures to seek to improve DHS's capacity to address transportation security, cybersecurity, and bomb detection, and to improve acquisition and DHS partnerships with nonprofits at risk of terrorism. I support them all and would note that there is bipartisan agreement on just about all of them. I'm particularly pleased that we are considering a bill I recently introduced with the ranking member and a number of my committee colleagues, H.R. 6825, the Nonprofit Security Grant Program Improvement Act of 2022. My legislation and the amendment in the nature of a substitute before us today will strengthen the Nonprofit Security Grant Program by authorizing funding at $500 million, a historic level that is responsive to the dynamic terrorism threat landscape facing nonprofits, including houses of worship and historically Black colleges and universities, directing FEMA to take a range of actions to improve the administration, management, and oversight of the program, and to improve outreach, engagement, education, and technical assistance, particularly to nonprofits in underserved communities. This critical grant program helps bolster security for at-risk nonprofits in urban and rural communities, and in January, got national attention when Rabbi Charlie Citron Walker, the heroic rabbi who brought a terrorist hostage standoff to a peaceful resolution, credited the program as being a major factor in his preparedness. I thank the Jewish Federation of North America, ADL, Sikh Coalition, Secure Communities Network, Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, and the National Baptist Convention, USA, Incorporated, for supporting this bill. Without objection, I include, for the record, letters of support from the Jewish Federation of North America, Secure Communities Network, the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations of America, and the National Baptist Convention, USA, Incorporated. I'm also pleased with that we are considering legislation authored by Congressman Pete Aguilar. His bill seeks to improve Congress's ability to respond to investigative findings of the FBI, DOJ, and DHS after a terrorist incident. I have an amendment in the nature of a substitute that updates the bill to improve the quality of information provided to Congress. Finally, I'd like to note that I'm glad that we are considering timely and common sense legislation authored by the chair of the Transportation and Maritime Security Subcommittee, Congresswoman Watson Coleman, to address the explosive growth in the number of firearms that TSA is detecting at passenger checkpoints. For years, TSA has been sounding alarm bells about the increase in firearms detected at checkpoints. As an avid sportsman and someone who flies frequently, I'm troubled to see so many fellow gun owners show up at TSA checkpoints with firearms in their carry-on bags. Last November, an incident in which a gun was discharged at Atlanta's International Airport drove home the potential dangers involved. I commend Congresswoman Watson Coleman for developing a targeted, sensible bill to help gun owners follow the law and make aviation safer and more secure. On the subject of aviation security, I would note that I am also gravely concerned about the number of in-flight incidents involving violent and unruly passengers. In response, the committee is working with TSA and others on legislation to better position flight crews to defend themselves and their passengers against such security threats. I'm hopeful that the next time we come together in a markup, we'll be considering legislation to require TSA to expand advanced self-defense training for flight crews. And now a couple of administrative points. The chair wishes to announce that to the extent practicable, it is my intention to postpone any requests for recorded votes to the end of legislative business and to recognize members to speak on their measures after voting concludes. The chair reminds members participating remotely to have their cameras on during recorded votes. Members are further reminded that the committee will operate according to the guidelines laid out by myself and the ranking member in our February 3rd, 2021 colloquy regarding remote procedures. The chair would also like to take this opportunity to address updated guidance from the Office of Attending Physician. While the House remains in a covered period pursuant to Section 3 of House Resolution 8, the full committee will hold hearings and markup in a hybrid format to the greatest extent practicable, and subcommittees will hold hearings in a format chosen by the respective chairs. The chair also reminds everyone to respect the wishes and needs of members and staff who choose to continue to wear masks and socially distance. With that, I thank the members for their participation today and now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Katko, for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I make my statement, I want to echo your sentiments about Ukraine. It is a tragedy that we can all argue how it happened and why it happened and who's responsible, but the bottom line is it's here. And it's causing great distress and disturbance to people around the world. And my heart breaks for the people in Ukraine. And it hits home for me because I have relatives over there that are in harm's way. And so for me, it's very serious, like it is for everyone else. And my thoughts and prayers are with the Ukrainian people. And from a military standpoint, it doesn't look great. But I applaud the administration's very strong sanctions. And I hope that they continue to ratchet up in conjunction with other world leaders around the world. and that we make it so untenable for them to be in Ukraine that Russia sees the light and gets out. And let's pray that that happens sooner rather than later. And while I'm pleased we're having this markup today, Mr. Chairman, I remain concerned that this committee has yet to address the ongoing crisis at our southwest border. There were over 153,000 encounters at the southwest border in January, which marks the 11th straight month with more than 150,000 encounters. That's a trend that has never been encountered before. Additionally, in the first few months of fiscal year 2022, Customs and Border Patrol has already seized over 234,000 pounds of drugs, including over 3,500 pounds of fentanyl, which is now the leading cause of death, fentanyl overdoses, for Americans aged 16 to 45. That is a stunning statistic. There is no denying this crisis, which is why this committee must act. I look forward to considering the legislation at our next markup that prioritizes border security and the drug crisis. Regarding today's bills, I am proud of the measures put forward by my Republican colleagues, and I commend Representative LaTurner and Representative Clyde for the work to get two very important acquisition reform bills in front of this committee. These bills will enhance acquisition processes, authorities, and accountability at the department while ensuring that Congress has stronger oversight over major acquisitions. With executive branch spending and economic pressures on Americans only increasing, these bills could not come at a better time, and I thank them for those bills. I also thank Representative Garbarino for his continued leadership supporting cybersecurity education, training, and resources. The Cybersecurity Grants for Schools Act is critical for investing in our cyber defense and the future of our students. Additionally, I sincerely appreciate Vice Ranking Member Guest's steadfast determination to counter the ongoing threat from China. The No TikTok on Department of Homeland Security Devices Act is a common sense bill that mitigates the risk posed by Chinese technology. Mr. Chairman, I'm also proud to support your Nonprofit Security Grant Program Improvement Act. FEMA's Nonprofit Security Grant Program is one of the most important resources available to nonprofit organizations, especially our houses of worship. Faith-based communities across the country face varying levels of discrimination, and it is vital that we strengthen our nation's emergency preparedness posture to prevent violence against all religious groups. Lastly, Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your supporting my bill, the Securing the Checkpoint Property Screening System Act. This bill would authorize appropriations for the full requirement of computed tomography units at airports nationwide. It is absolutely imperative that TSA quickly replace its outdated X-ray screening at airports with advanced detection capability that the CT technology provides. Unfortunately, the Office of Management and Budget, the Department of Homeland Security, and even Congress have failed to fully fund this important program, despite longstanding bipartisan support from this committee. At current funding levels, TSA won't fully deploy this modern technology to all checkpoints nationwide for another 10 to 15 years, which is completely unacceptable based on the current threat environment. My bill authorizes full funding for the CT program to send a strong message that it is long past time for the executive branch and Congress to fully support this critical security technology. As I've said before, I'm extremely concerned about the Biden administration's withdrawal from Afghanistan and how that has created a safe new haven for terrorists. Our homeland is at risk again, and it is imperative that TSA have all the technology and tools at its disposal it needs to detect evolving terrorist threats to aviation. As I've said many times before, a bomb the size of an average cell phone can bring down an airliner, and it is imperative that we have this technology today, not 10 or 15 years from now at all airports. I also appreciate the Chairman's input on this bill to enhance support for small businesses. Importantly, this bill strengthens TSA's research and development and private sector partnerships for critical technology innovations like software and third-party algorithm development. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to support this critical legislation that will strengthen our nation's aviation security. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Katko. Other members of the committee are reminded that opening statements may be submitted for the record. By agreement between the chair and ranking member, the committee, by unanimous consent, shall use an amendment roster today.
Reserving the right to object, and I will not object. Would the chair please explain the agreement regarding the amendment roster? And I yield to the chairman.
I thank the gentleman and all committee members for agreeing to use of an amendment roster. We've agreed that the bills be open to amendment at any point and that we will take up amendments in the order listed on the roster. The chair will allow members to offer amendments listed on the roster out of order to the extent practicable and in a manner not prohibited by House or committee rules. Amendments not listed on the roster may be considered at the conclusion of consideration of the roster. Also, by unanimous consent, the chair will recognize members with bills or amendments, including in a list of agreed-upon measures for statements at the conclusion of the markup.
I thank the chair for his explanation, and I withdraw my reservation.
Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6825. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6825, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to enhance the funding and administration of the Nonprofit Security Grant Program of the Department of Homeland Security and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, and notwithstanding Committee Rule 2B, the clerk shall report the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself, previously noted on the roster.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6825, offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. I now recognize myself to explain the amendment. As I mentioned in my opening statement, this bill authorized funding for the Nonprofit Security Grant Program at a level responsive to the dynamic terrorism threat landscape facing nonprofits. The amendment in the nature of a substitute reflects feedback from FEMA and addresses parliamentary and technical issues that were resolved after Friday's markup notice was issued. I thank my colleagues for their support of this bill and remind them that there will be an opportunity to speak to all measures at the end of today's business. With that, I yield back. If there's no further discussion at this time and there are no further amendments, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6825.
Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I have a concern regarding 6825. I'd perhaps give the gentleman an opportunity to address the 6825, the legislation authors.
Does the gentleman ask for unanimous consent to speak out of order?
I believe you were about to call the bill for a vote, Mr. Chairman.
No, not the substitute. We call him for a vote.
Oh, I apologize. I withdraw my request to be recognized, Mr. Chairman.
Those in favor saying aye. 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 Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 6825, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 6387. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6387, to amend the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to establish a school security coordinating council and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. Without objection, notwithstanding Committee Rule 2B, the clerk shall report the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Mr. Payne, previously noticed on the roster.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6387, offered by Mr. Payne.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. If there's no further discussion at this time and there are no further amendments, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6387. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 6387 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I now call up H.R. 1540. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 1540, to provide for joint reports by relevant federal agencies to Congress regarding incidents of terrorism and for other purposes.
Without objection, the first reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. It is now in order to consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by myself previously noticed on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1540 offered by Mr. Thompson.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. It is now in order to consider the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Jackson Lee, previously noted on the roster. I would remind members that since we have a significant number of measures to go through and there's general bipartisan agreement on most, in the interest of time, members are encouraged to hold off on offering their statements in support of amendments or bill until their voting is completed. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1540 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee.
If there's no further discussion at this time, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1540 offered by Ms. Jackson Lee. Those in favor say aye. 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 Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the Jackson Lee amendment is agreed to. If there are no further discussion at this time and there are no further amendments, the question is on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 1540 as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill H.R. 1540 as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid on the table. Pursuant to notice, I call up H.R. 6856. The bill was circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The clerk shall designate the bill.
H.R. 6856, to reduce the number of firearms at Transportation Security Administration passenger screening checkpoints by directing the administrator to carry out a range of activities to inform the public about restrictions regarding the carrying of firearms in sterile areas of airports and to strengthen enforcement of such restrictions and for other purposes.
Without objection, the reading of the bill is dispensed with, and the bill is considered read and open to amendment at any point. The chair will now recognize members with amendments appearing on the roster. It is now in order to consider the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by Ms. Watson Coleman, previously noted on the roster. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 offered by Mrs. Watson Coleman.
Without objection, the reading is dispensed with, and amendment in the nature of a substitute shall be considered base text for purpose of further amendment. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from New Jersey.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For years, TSA and stakeholders have expressed to the committee grave concern about the troubling increase in firearms identified at passenger screening points. In fact, I remember the issue of firearms in carry-on bags being raised 5 years ago at my very first hearing as the top Democrat on the subcommittee that oversees TSA. At the time, then committee chairman Katko stated that he was troubled that TSA had found 3,300 firearms in 2016. I remember leaving that hearing being struck by how many firearms TSA was finding during routine passenger screenings. Shockingly, today the number of TSA detects is nearly doubled what it was then. Last year, TSA caught nearly 6,000 firearms, and 86% of them were loaded. And remarkably, just since the beginning of COVID, the number of firearms caught at checkpoints has doubled on a per passenger basis. Last month, as chairwoman of the Subcommittee on Transportation and Maritime Security, I convened a hearing on this surge in firearms at TSA checkpoints. And the hearing made one thing abundantly clear: Congress must act urgently. All our witnesses agreed that there was more that we could and should do. Witnesses representing law enforcement, airports, and labor spoke about the importance of TSA enforcement efforts, as well as educating the public and about the consequences of bringing a firearm to the checkpoint. And the witness invited by my subcommittee ranking member, Mr. Jimenez, Miami International Airport Director and CEO Ralph Coutier, spoke convincingly about the effectiveness of Miami's airport's signage campaign and how it could serve as a model for the country. They testified and we listened. The legislation before you is straightforward. First, it requires TSA to install universal signage to alert passengers that firearms are generally prohibited in carry-on bags. In carrying out this effort, TSA is directed to give heightened attention to the airports with the highest number of firearm interdictions. Second, it directs TSA to carry out a public awareness campaign that incorporates social media, press, local organizations, and transportation stakeholders to reach gun owners who may not be aware of the rules so they can plan ahead and avoid breaking the law. Third, the bill establishes a minimum civil penalty for repeat and egregious violators. The enhanced fines apply to passengers who have brought firearms to a checkpoint 2 or more times or engage in egregious conduct, like deliberately hiding their firearm or trying to bring an assault rifle onto a plane. Fourth, my legislation codifies TSA's long-standing practice of suspending pre-check eligibility for those caught with a gun at a checkpoint. Expedited screening is a privilege, not a right, and individuals who bring loaded firearms to checkpoints should not have access to a pre-check line. Finally, my legislation increases Congress's ability to conduct oversight on these issues by requiring reporting from the TSA and the GAO. Recent events show why we must. In November, a firearm was accidentally discharged at a TSA checkpoint in Atlanta, which placed workers and passengers in danger and brought the world's busiest airport to a halt for more than 2 hours. 3 people were injured in the resulting chaos. Fortunately, no one was killed, but make no mistake, with the number of guns TSA finds at checkpoints increasing year after year, and with the vast majority of those guns loaded, it is only a matter of time until a tragedy does occur. That's why I feel strongly that we must act urgently and with conviction and come together in a bipartisan way to advance this bill. I greatly appreciate Ranking Member Katko and Jimenez's willingness to work with me on getting the bill to a good place. As Mr. Jimenez said at our hearing, quote, "This should not be a partisan issue. This is not about gun control, but about aviation security," end quote. And I couldn't agree more. I plan to support Mr. Jimenez's amendment, which directs TSA to utilize the money it collects from fines from repeat and egregious offenders on screening technology. Mr. Jimenez's amendment improves the underlying bill, and it's a fitting complement to a bill we are considering today to accelerate TSA's procurement of computed tomography equipment that the ranking member, my friend Mr. Katko, introduced, and I am proud to co-sponsor. I want to thank Mr. Katko and his staff for working with us to ensure the bill will increase opportunities available to small businesses to participate in the Checkpoint Property Screening System program. Before I close, I'd like to make a few final points to those of you on the other side of the aisle who may have discomfort supporting anything that includes the word firearm in it. First, I would remind you that annually we spend billions of dollars securing the sterile areas of airports and planes. The measure legislation before you today is simply focused on protecting that investment and the flying public. Second, I would underscore that the adjustments to the penalties in the bill would not impact most individuals who bring guns to TSA checkpoints, as the penalties in my legislation only apply to repeat offenders and those engaged in egregious conduct. So let me repeat. My legislation does not impose any new fines on typical first-time offenders, and it also does not place any new restrictions on gun ownership. HR 6856 is supported by the Air Marshal Association.
Gentlelady's time
the
has
Association
expired.
of-
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent to submit the letters of support on behalf of this legislation from the Air Marshals Association, the Association of Professional Flight Attendants, and the TWA, and the American Federation of Government Employees.
Without objection.
Thank you,
Gentlelady's,
and with that,
again, time has expired.
yeah, thank you, sir.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, in reading through this bill, I see that, that the first part of it talks about, you know, a second violation, but there's a part in here that talks about minimum civil monetary penalties for egregious violations involving a firearm. Now, what is an egregious violation? All right? The bill says there's a $5,000 fine for any violation in which the administrator of TSA determines or otherwise is egregious, including if the firearm is of a nature or type that poses a greater risk to aviation security than firearms typically identified at passenger screening points. What's the definition of that? What is a firearm that poses a greater risk to aviation security than a firearm normally identified at a screening point? As well, the same thing is asked about ammunition. Identified with ammunition that is of a nature or type that poses a greater risk to aviation security than ammunition typically identified at passenger screening points. What kind of ammunition are we talking about? There's no definition here, number one. I mean, in my lifetime, I've probably seen most every kind of ammunition that exists, being that this was my trade before I became a member. And I am at a loss to see what the definition is here that would allow TSA to put the label of egregious on this particular, on ammunition or a firearm. I mean, can someone define for me, please, Ms. Watson-Coleman, define what kind of firearms you're talking about? What is typically identified at a screening point, and then what is egregious? And I'll offer to yield to her if she'll answer that, please.
It's up to the gentleman.
With your permission, sir? With your permission?
If you could tell me what,
Yes.
What is the type of firearm that you mean, or what is the type of ammunition that you mean? What is more egregious, all right, than what is typically found at an airport? That would
Well, I think other
warrant-
than,
Go ahead.
I think, thank you for yielding to me. I think other than what is obvious as a more dangerous weapon, or perhaps ammunition, we thought it best to leave it to the TSA to establish what it felt to be a greater threat and to categorize it as such. I yield back.
Okay, so this is then left to TSA to determine that, but yet we are implementing a mandatory $5,000 fine. I mean, if we look at the people that normally, that bring by accident firearms into a specifically screened area, I mean, Time Magazine wrote an article about this, October the 14th, 2021, where a TSA spokesperson said that the recent surge in TSA confiscations isn't because of an increase in any sort of domestic terrorism or any sort of criminal activity, but partially because more people own firearms and because people are flying for the first time since the start of the pandemic. They are leaving home in a stressed state without focusing on exactly where their gun is. They're thinking about not missing their plane. How many people go to the airport in a stressed way? Most everybody does, because they don't want to miss their plane. It's a big deal. Can anyone claim they've never forgotten something when traveling or accidentally brought something they didn't intend to bring? This is not malicious. It constitutes an honest mistake that a gun owner might have after using their particular piece of luggage or bag for going to the range or just carrying their firearm from one place to another. And we are now offering or requiring mandatory fines. In addition, the person loses their firearm. I mean, my word, those people who don't own firearms may not think that's a big deal, but those of us who do, that's a pretty huge deal. That's very, very important. So this is a big issue here. There's that number one, it's left up to TSA to determine the intent of Congress here. And so I would hope that all members would vote against this. And I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Rhode Island moves to strike the last word.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I support the gentlelady's bill. At this time, I'd like to yield my time to the gentlelady, Ms. Watson-Coleman, for additional comment.
Gentlelady is recognized.
Yeah.
Thank you very much to my colleague for allowing me a few more seconds. Number one, that TSA has the discretion in determining what the response should be to first time and repeated and egregious or any other sort of declaration that they determine that represents a danger to passengers or crew. So we're not instituting anything new, sir. We're just sort of codifying some of the things that it already does and establishing that the consequences of carrying a firearm without permission illegally will result in a reaction. Thank you. I yield back.
Chair recognizes gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I was going to yield to the gentle lady from New Jersey, and I won't take up all the time, but I do think that we need to understand that I mean, this is a serious deal. Like almost everyone in this room, I average out about 1,800 air miles a week, and with all of the disruption on the airplanes in recent times, it's a very, very serious issue for someone to get on a plane with a fire or attempt to get on a plane with a firearm. And whatever we need to do to continue to make our domestic or international, for that matter, commercial airliners as safe as possible. Think of what could happen when some of the disruptive passengers stand up and start screaming or attacking the flight attendants. I mean, we could have a horrible problem in the air. So I understand, Mr. Clyde, I understand your concerns, but this is just too serious a matter for us to act as if, we forgot a toothbrush or something. I mean, I don't, I try to, I have never accidentally brought my toothbrush on an airplane. There's intentionality, and to forget something as major as a gun is a serious problem. People need help if they forget about a firearm. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back.
Mr. Chairman,
Chair recognizes the gentleman from
North Carolina. Move to strike the last word. It's evident to me that, I think we have a pattern on this committee of almost purposefully misidentifying the source of homeland risk, including risk to aviation. It is emphatically not law-abiding citizens, gun owners, who, through a mental lapse, omit to remove a stored firearm from their duffel bag before passing through the metal detector. To take a punitive approach to those people in the way that Mr. Clyde has described, and in a way that leaves entirely to the discretion of bureaucrats to characterize their weapon as egregious without any guides to their discretion whatsoever, it simply evinces a hostility to the fundamental right that's embodied in the Second Amendment to keep and bear arms. And it is not, and I think Mr. Clyde will speak to this at some point, it is also, given the mode in which it's proposed as a civil penalty, it is also an attack on due process. I'll leave further comments for that, but I'll now yield to the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you. This particular civil violation, it's mandatory. It takes away the discretion of TSA. It takes away their discretion to say, you know what, this particular person, they had no evil intent here. There was no criminal intent. This was just simply a mistake. And so they're getting a minimum $5,000 or $10,000 fine for a simple mistake. I mean, that just doesn't make sense to me. That is that is penalizing a firearm owner. In addition to them, again, losing their firearm, which could be hundreds or thousands of dollars, all right, simply because it's in a bag that they may not have considered. I mean, for folks in the gun industry that travel with firearms all the time, or people that carry firearms all the time, it becomes like second nature to have your firearm on you. So these people are not criminals. You're using a civil process that has a burden of proof that is much lower than any sort of a criminal process. It's simply a preponderance of the evidence. Where on the criminal process, it's beyond a reasonable doubt. So you have to take motive into consideration in a much more serious way than in a civil, than when it comes to a civil fine. And that's just not the way it should be here. We need to not be penalizing firearms owners in a mandatory way. We need to give TSA the discretion to do what they think is right. And that's not what this bill is doing. It is requiring, it is codifying, putting into law mandatory minimums. Now, there's no maximum here either. And I find an issue with that too. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes gentlelady from Texas, Ms. Jackson Lee.
For those of us who have been on this committee, I thank the chairman, we have had to confront the terrible loss of life of Mr. Geraldo Hernandez, TSA officer that was killed at Los Angeles Airport, mind you, by a crazed individual, but carrying an assault weapon. But the actual impact included the injuring of 6 in the midst of women and children. One cannot determine whether the carrying of a weapon is accidental or not. The gist of this bill is very positive. And I hope my friends would realize that this is a bill to, in fact, help be fair to gun owners so that they can avoid fines. It's giving them a roadmap and instruction, prominent signage, enhancing TSA's responsibility of educating the public. You have your views. I come from Texas. We have a mindless, permitless carry bill, but we have it. It is mindless. And I would share with you the rising statistics of gun violence that it is partly contributing to. But the main point is that this bill is not punitive. Its main focus is educational, and it is, of course, helpful, I think, to gun owners to not be in the dark, to ensure that they see big signs. That's fair to them. That's notice. People do have a slip of the memory, if you will. The bill focuses on an individual who does this at a checkpoint 2 or more times. It does not get the innocent person who just forgot that the gun was buried in her purse. That has happened. Or the gun is in his briefcase or in his duffel bag. That individual still has the courtesy of the discretion of TSA. But if someone continues 2 or more occasions, there is the potential for a civil fine. There is a potential for the loss of pre-check eligibility. And so if you have the TSA reporting that 5,700 guns were confiscated last year, the most in the agency's 20-year history, that's a dangerous proposition. We're playing with fire. And I think this is a responsible approach to addressing the question in a helpful manner. And I think it's important to teach the Constitution correctly. The Constitution requires and protects the Second Amendment. I, for one, have no desire to undermine, eliminate, or to pose another amendment to get rid of the Second Amendment. I know the historical fact is to ensure the standing up of militia in the era that it was written. There is nothing there that says that you cannot effectively frame a constructive response to safety. And I don't even call it regulating. I want to ensure that the traveling public is safe. I want to ensure that the TSA officers are safe. I want to say to Mr. Geraldo Hernandez's family that we'll do everything we can in his name, now dead, in a very emotional interaction with his family, that it won't happen to another TSA officer, just as we got a late start on TSA officers in the pandemic. They had a high number of people getting sick and dying. We have a responsibility to the traveling public. We have a responsibility to mom and dad and those going off to Disneyland, Disney World, going off for their summer vacation, and then someone has a gun that may be ill-used. So this is heavy work for TSA officers. It's heavy work because they are now dealing with an individual whose gun may be intentionally there, or if not, it is armed or it has ammunition, if I might say that appropriately. And I think this is a bare minimum in the name of Mr. Hernandez to make sure that TSA officers are safe and that they're well-trained. They're not intending to, how should I say, stalk the public, but to make the public travelers safe. So I ask support of the gentlelady's bill as it is amended, and I thank the chairman for yielding. With that, I yield back.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
Mr.
Gentleman
Chairman,
from
Mr. Chairman.
Mississippi is recognized.
Move to strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized.
Mr. Chairman, I think there's been some very valid arguments that Mr. Clyde has brought forth. And I would disagree with my friend from Texas when she says that no one can determine if the carrying of a firearm is accidental. We have seen our Congress in recent years, particularly as it relates to things which can be considered criminal in nature, We've moved away from the mandatory minimum sentences that courts had to impose. We've moved away from strict liability. I think that we have to entrust in our TSA officers that they can look at a situation and they can make a determination as to whether the carrying of a firearm was accidental or not. And if this bill is strictly about educational, that we need more signage, that we need to make people more aware, I think all Republicans would agree that we have no argument at all with that. We support an educational process. We support additional signage. But when we are allowing TSA or requiring TSA for weapons that fall into these certain categories that have been identified by Mr. Clyde to impose a minimum $5,000 fine on that individual, I believe that is too strict and too severe. I personally know individuals who have been, who have unfortunately accidentally left firearms in their carry-on. Mr. Chairman, I think you and I know that there was a former statewide elected official in Mississippi who was traveling through the TSA airport there in Jackson and had accidentally left a firearm in his carry-on luggage. There's no doubt, because we know that individually personally, he had no ill will, no intent. But if the TSA identifies this weapon as a weapon which poses a greater risk to aviation, or if an individual just has ammunition, not even a firearm, just ammunition that somehow some bureaucrat in TSA identifies as posing a greater risk to aviation, then that individual has a mandatory $5,000 fine. I think this strict liability standard that we are considering adopting in this legislation is wrong. I agree, I support the signage, I support the education, but unless this body moves to strike this language, I cannot support this bill as it is written. And Mr. Chairman, I, at this time, would yield back. I will yield.
Mr. Chairman?
And I thank the gentleman for yielding. I abhor mandatory minimums. I think the way the legislation is written is that they're not mandatory minimums, but they're discretionary. There's also the appeal of the penalty, but I think your point is well taken, but I think you're interpreting it wrong, that they're a minimum, but it is in the discretion of the officer or whoever, I'm sorry, not the officer, it's obviously a civil proceeding, but the court, that the discretion can be with respect to what the minimum might be, that there's not a mandatory minimum, that it's discretion in the court proceedings. And so I hope the gentleman, I think we need to explore that further. You're absolutely right. I think we've gotten rid of mandatory minimums. But in this instance, let me just be clear. The gentleman that left his suit in his travel bag, he's not subject to this. It is the person that has gone over 2 times, and here they come again. Let's hope that there's signage that they will remember and come back again and just say, let me check my bag. But that person will not be subject to that. We appreciate those kinds of lapses. We want to be sympathetic to that, but we also got to be sympathetic to Mr. Hernandez, who's dead because guns got into an area that is so confined that it is so potential for an explosive response. So I just say to the gentleman, I agree with you on mandatory minimums. I don't think this can be interpreted as such, and I thank the gentleman for yielding.
Would the gentlelady yield back?
I yield back to the gentleman.
And I would agree, there is a subsection in this bill which talks about repeat offenders. But there is a second subsection that would apply to first offenders. And it would apply to first offenders if TSA, not Congress, not this body, but if a bureaucrat from TSA identifies or makes a decision that either a firearm or ammunition alone without a firearm poses a greater risk. And so we're looking at 2 different penalty sections. We're looking for the repeat offender penalty section, which the gentlelady is talking about. But then on the following page, we talk about, and this is what Representative Clyde has brought up, that for first offenders, if the weapon, and not only the weapon, if the ammunition by itself is deemed by a bureaucrat to pose a greater risk to aviation, there is a $5,000 mandatory minimum as I read the legislation. And I'm not trying to be argumentative, but I think that this is an important point to point out to this entire body. If we are going to be voting on this legislation as amended, we are, in my opinion, going to be imposing a $5,000 mandatory penalty on first offenders if it reads this very unclear definition that is contained in the body of this statute. And Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from.
Chairman.
Gentleman from California, Mr. Correa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to say that I am in strong support of this legislation. I'm listening to my colleagues, and I like the debate, bringing up some very important issues. I've been a weapons owner for a very long time. And late last year, I should say early last year, there are certain events, I decided to apply to my local sheriff to get a concealed carry permit. Went through the training, and it was interesting going through all those hours of discussions of scenarios. My local sheriff made some very important, clear points. Number one, do not cause dangerous situations to yourself or to others. Do not put public safety officers in harm's way or yourself in harm's way. Do not take weapons where weapons are prohibited. If you're ever pulled over, the first thing you do is you pull out that concealed carry permit, you show it to the police officer, and you say, there's my weapon. If you ever go in a situation, in a place where a weapon is prohibited by law, an airport or a school or another place of that sort, you will lose your permit. I understand what my colleagues are saying about your rights, but let's balance that to responsibility. If you carry a weapon, you better have some common sense. If you carry a weapon, you are carrying some serious responsibility on your shoulder. TSA bureaucrats are also TSA officers. Like any police officer out in the street, you have split seconds to make very deadly decisions. You are a judge, jury, and executioner in a split second. Why in God's name would you put somebody out there in harm's way? If you're going to carry a weapon, you better make sure you know how to be responsible. Airports, like schools, have a very high priority, are very special places when it comes to public safety. You bring in a weapon to an airport, you have the option of checking it in so that officers know that you have a weapon. You check it in, and it goes through a special process. For you to forget that you've got a weapon on board and somebody has an x-ray and figures out that there's a weapon there, what is the expectation of that TSA officer? How is that officer going to react? And are you creating a dangerous situation? I would say probably so. This is not a legislation designed to take anybody's rights away. It's about making sure you with your weapon can essentially survive and live in a situation where there's a public safety officer that's there to protect the public. And in those moments, that officer doesn't know who you are, what your intentions are, or what's going to happen next. We have other legislation that we are entertaining today to defend our nonprofit institutions. Same thing. You have people that walk in with weapons, you have no idea what their state of mind is. Again, I own weapons. I'm a responsible owner, and I want to make sure that anybody else around me that carries a weapon is also responsible. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I yield the remainder of my time.
Mr. Chair, strike the last word.
Mr. Payne, you recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I just want to say I agree with everything Mr. Correa said. Ladies and gentlemen, we just can't forget oops, I forgot my toothbrush. I forgot my comb. I forgot my gun was in the bag. Let's really think about that. But at this time, I'd like to yield, bounce my time to the gentlelady from New Jersey, Miss Watson Coleman.
Gentlelady from New Jersey is recognized.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to my colleague for yielding to me. And thank you all for the rich conversation we've had around this very important bill. Please let me assure you that I'm not interested in making life difficult for innocent people who simply forget that they had their gun in their carry-on luggage. Although for someone like me, I could probably forget my toothbrush, which I have. I'd never forget a gun. But I want to bring our attention to the fact that there are conditions for the minimum civil monetary penalties. And it says for $10,000 for any knowing violation in the case of a deliberate attempt to conceal such a firearm. That's not an innocent. A $5,000 violation with which the administrator of the TSA determines is otherwise egregious, including if the firearm at issue is A, known to the administrator to not contain a serial number when required by law, not innocent. Two, have been manufactured using additive layer manufacturing, commonly known as 3D printing, not such an innocent thing. Of a nature or type that poses a greater risk to aviation security than firearms typically identified at passenger screening points, and identified with ammunition that is of a nature of type that poses a greater risk to aviation security than ammunition typically identified at passenger screening checkpoints. So I do believe that there has been considerable discussion and deliberation and consideration of what we should be talking about and what we should be concerned about in protecting our traveling public, protecting our other passengers, protecting our crew members. And I am very comfortable with this language and do not feel that there are any unintended consequences. I also wish to note that there are administrative procedures where if someone feels that they've been egregiously, may I say, fined, that they have a recourse, that they can have that questioned and reconsidered. Thank you for yielding to me, and I yield back.
Will the gentlelady yield?
Gentlelady's yielded.
Yes.
Thank you. Ma'am, you made a comment that you said that 3D printing is not such an innocent thing. Well, I beg to differ with you, but 3D printing...
I'm sorry, I did say yes, Mr. Chairman. If I had any more time, I didn't even know who asked me.
Gentleman from New Jersey controls the time, not the gentlelady from New Jersey.
Excuse me, please.
Does the gentleman from New Jersey wish to yield time?
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that. 3D printing, the comment that was made, it's not such an innocent thing. 3D printing is actually a very modern and technologically advanced method of current firearm manufacture. There are multiple actual firearm manufacturers that use 3D printing in manufacturing a firearm. So now you would make a current manufacturer's process, an egregious violation here. That's counterproductive to advanced manufacturing in this country. So I think that's a serious problem right here. And then we also have the fact that these fines are so large that this bill offers a payment plan. A payment plan by the government. The only other section or entity in the government that I know that offers a payment plan is the IRS. It's not Department of Homeland Security. So with that, I yield back.
Thank you very much.
Mr. Chairman, move to strike the last
The
word.
gentleman's time has expired, but for the record, ghost guns are illegal, and that's part of that 3D manufacturing. So you can't bring those through. So, gentleman from Louisiana is recognized.
I thank the chairman. Move to strike the last word. Mr. Chairman, this bill was introduced just a couple of days ago. It's obviously controversial. I have deep respect for my colleague, Ms. Watson Coleman, and I respectfully suggest that she consider at this time withdrawing the bill for markup consideration, whereby we as committee members can further discuss this bill among staff and perhaps arrive at a bipartisan conclusion regarding language. That's my respectful suggestion at this point, and I would yield time to my colleague, Ms. Watson Coleman, to respond to that.
Thank you to my
Gentlelady is
colleague.
recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for my colleague for presenting that option to me. I respectfully decline.
Gentlelady yields back.
Reclaiming my time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this is just an effort to find a path forward for our committee. This is a controversial bill. I believe it's as written. It's a bad bill. It's such a bad bill that constitutionalists will oppose it in every way. It will not pass by voice. It will not pass without objection. We will speak on it on the floor. We will do everything in our power to protect the rights and freedoms of the American citizens we serve, to keep and bear arms. My colleagues have mentioned toothbrushes several times. May I state that the founders did not establish inalienable rights to keep and bear a toothbrush. We have a further infringement upon the rights and freedoms of American citizens here. I'll be offering an amendment on the bill that will fix it, but I just wanted to give my colleague, whom I again, let me restate, I have the deepest respect for her, and I thought perhaps it would be appropriate that we withdraw the bill from consideration today. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes.
Chairman.
Gentlelady from New York.
Mr. Chairman. I thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me for her diligence and the work that she has done in presenting this legislation today. My colleagues, an unprecedented 6,000 firearms were detected at TSA checkpoints last year. That's an all-time high and double the rate on a per passenger basis that we saw just 2 years ago. If just one of these firearms made it onto a plane and into the hands of a hijacker, the consequences could be and would be deadly. Every day, about 16 times a day, a gun is detected in a carry-on. Each time this happens, law enforcement resources are diverted, people are put at risk, and the movements of innocent travelers are disrupted, not to mention all of the employees that keep our airports running. Recently, the 3 people were and countless flights were delayed for 2.5 hours at the busiest airport in the world, Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, when a gun and a carry-on bag accidentally discharged at a TSA checkpoint. The economic disruption that a gun at a checkpoint can cause, particularly at this time when the aviation sector is still hurting from the pandemic, is no small matter. Furthermore, I fear that it's only a matter of time before something even more devastating than what we saw in Atlanta occurs. And as we heard at our recent hearing on this topic, law enforcement, airports, and labor all agree that something must be done. The Securing Air Travel Act is a long overdue effort to address this urgent crisis. HR 6856 is not about punishing gun owners, and that's very clear in the language. To the contrary, it's about helping gun owners learn the law, follow the rules, and avoid the costly consequences of bringing a gun to a checkpoint. It focuses on helping TSA up its game when dealing with this Homeland Security challenge by requiring signage and a public campaign to help law-abiding gun owners by being more vigilant and avoid violating the law. It is fair to say that Securing Air Travel Act is about helping gun owners avoid fines and in some cases, even jail time. However, Those individuals who deliberately bring guns to checkpoints or do so repeatedly would be subject to a minimum civil penalty to deter such behavior and protect the traffic. Importantly, A 6856 also focuses on those who bring dangerous firearms to checkpoints. Someone forgetting a handgun in the bag, simply not the same thing as bringing a loaded machine gun to a checkpoint. The language in the underlying bill reinforces TSA's use of aggravating factors in determining penalty and amounts. Finally, the bill codifies TSA's longstanding practice of suspending individuals who are caught with firearms at TSA checkpoints from accessing expedited screening and pre-check lanes. You simply aren't a trusted traveler if you almost brought a gun onto a plane. I would stress that this bill does not increase fines or impose any new consequences on first-time violators who accidentally brought a handgun to a checkpoint. Rather, it directs TSA to make investments in signage and education to help gun owners avoid breaking the law in the first place. The Securing Air Travel Act is about aviation security, nothing more, nothing less. With all of the investments we have made since September 11th, security within sterile areas of airports and on planes, we can't ignore what TSA tells us is putting aviation at risk 16 times a day, firearms and carry-on life. With that, Mr. Chairman, okay.
Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from North Carolina, South Carolina, I'm sorry, Mr. Norman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As I've listened to this discussion, I really feel that we've got a couple of problems here. One, egregious has really never been defined. How do you define that?
Exactly.
You're putting a lot of power in the hands of a TSA agent. Secondly, if this is an educational issue, I mean, all of us have flown before, and you see a little sign when you get up to the checkpoint. If it's reminding people, which I think it is, I think a lot could be done to improve that. As far as the number of guns, being 6,000, people are scared now. Law-abiding citizens are scared because of the lawlessness that exists all over this country. The defund the police movement, the handcuffs that are put on police. Look at the shootings in Chicago. But law-abiding citizens are getting guns, and I'm really cannot understand this heavy-handed approach when it needs a lot more discussion. And like has been said, there'll be amendments on the floor. I consider this an assault on the Second Amendment. And it shocks me that we're spending this much time on something that if we had time to debate it and before it's put in this form of put into the floor will be a lot more better, but that's not going to take place. But anyway, I would favor if it's education, I'd favor putting more signs up. I think that people are carrying more guns, and rightfully so for the law-abiding citizens. You're not going to stop the lawlessness that's taking place of the criminals that are going to get them anyway. But I hope we would reconsider this. But I intend to vote against it. I think it's will be a bad bill, and I hate to see this. We've debated this for over an hour now. But I yield the balance of my time for my friend from Georgia, Mr. Clyde.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If you look at how many people actually fly on an annual basis, it's in the hundreds of millions. And you look at the number of firearms that are actually caught by TSA, you said about 6,000. Granted, I would say one firearm is too many, absolutely. People should not be taking firearms into secure areas, and they should obey the law. And if they're doing it maliciously, why are we providing a civil penalty? If they're doing it maliciously, it should be a criminal penalty and not a civil penalty. But you've got a mandatory $10,000 fine, a civil fine, for someone, according to this, who is doing this egregiously with intent. All right? That's intent to break the law. That should be a criminal aspect, a criminal charge, and it shouldn't be civil. So I think when you have the intent aspect of it, that shouldn't be even in this bill whatsoever. But if you look at the number of people that actually travel on an annual basis, I believe it's somewhere in the 900 million. That is a truly very, very small number when compared to the number of people who actually travel. So with that, I would yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman?
Mr. Chairman,
No, that's coming up.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Jimenez,
thank you.
Florida.
Mr. Chairman, can we enter into a colloquy with the gentle lady from New Jersey?
Gentleman is recognized.
Yeah, I'd like to ask some questions if I could. Madam Chairwoman, today, if somebody is caught with a firearm on TSA, does TSA have the discretion to move forward, or just say, hey, it's a mistake and you can go on your way?
Thank you, Mr. Jimenez. TSA does have the discretion to remove the gun. TSA also has the discretion right now to fine the individual. Yeah.
Does this bill change any of that?
No.
Okay. On a second offense, if somebody comes in second time and they go again carrying a gun, does TSA have a procedure in place for that eventuality right now?
To some extent, yes. Yeah, I don't think it has it completely as codified here. Yeah.
In other words, I would assume that TSA has a certain procedures, right? That their TSA employees have to follow. If somehow it's the second offense, are you saying that the TSA individual at the gate has the discretion to say, I know it's your second offense, not a big deal, you can go on your way, or does TSA procedures say, no, this is what happens to you?
If it happens at the gate on the first, second, third, or fourth time, sir, it's not just the person who's checking the baggage that has something to say about it, but my understanding is that they actually remove it from the conveyor area into a secondary area, and then a supervisor is also brought in to evaluate the situation.
Right,
Now, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
My understanding is that there are other TSA professionals that do get engaged in assessing to the extent that the fine is established or the reaction or the response is impacted, is affected on the issue.
And the nature of the fines, are they the same as what you have in your proposed bill?
Yes, sir.
All right. If it's found to be an egregious kind of a weapon, does TSA know what that is? Egregious? Do they? This is egregious. This may not be egregious. And do they have some kind of discretion there?
Yes.
Is it changed? Does this bill change that in any way?
No.
Okay. And is that the same for ammunition?
Yes.
So if they find egregious ammunition right now, they could fine you. They could take you off take you off TSA, the whole thing. Can
Yes.
they do that now?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So basically, right now, it's all laid out for the discretion of the bureaucrats. They can do basically whatever they want.
Basically, the purpose of this legislation was to codify basically what they've been doing, as well as to engage in more robust educational efforts through signage and things of that nature, to try to avoid this as much as possible.
if we don't pass this bill, can TSA then do whatever they want? Can they up the fines if they wanted to?
You know, I really can't answer that. I'm not certain that it can't, but I don't know for sure at this moment.
Well, if we don't pass this bill, can TSA say their procedures say we have a we have a zero tolerance policy. First time, you're going to get fined. Can they do that?
Will the gentlelady yield?
They-
Will the gentlelady
Yes, sir.
yield? I think what the intent of the legislation is to codify the practices that TSA is already doing so that it becomes law. The other point to the gentleman from Florida is there will have to be a rulemaking process for this legislation that we'll all have an opportunity, if it becomes law, to respond to. So a lot of the questions that we are asking will not be addressed until we get to final passage and ultimate rulemaking on the law.
Okay, I guess my time is up. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you very much. Is there any further discussion on the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentlewoman from New Jersey, Ms. Watson Coleman?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Gentlemen, we're not ready. Just hold on. We gonna get to you. The chair will now recognize members with amendments to the amendment in the nature of a substitute appearing on the roster. It is now in order to consider the gentleman amendment on the roster offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, Mr. Higgins. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 offered by Mr. Higgins.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered read. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Louisiana for 5 minutes.
I thank the chairman for recognizing. Mr. Chairman, this is a bad bill. It was introduced just a couple of days ago. It's been moved to markup very quickly. It has consumed a tremendous amount of time for the legitimate debate. It should be withdrawn from markup consideration so that members would have an opportunity to truly review the language of the bill, and perhaps some bipartisan language could be agreed upon and we can move forward in another markup. That offer was gentlemanly, in a gentlemanly manner submitted. It was denied. And so here we are. So this bill will be opposed very, very strongly. My colleagues are referring to it as language that just codifies existing fines and procedures. But it equates to restriction of rights and freedoms of law-abiding Americans. It restricts our freedom to travel the land, restricts our Second Amendment rights to keep and bear arms, denies due process and proper judicial review when an American accused of committing an offense, a violation, of crime. It shifts it to a bureaucratic function as opposed to a proper judicial review where an American's rights are recognized in a court of law, and he has an opportunity to state his case. It criminalizes, I would presume, the travel records of American citizens. If you have language stating first offense, second offense, then there must be documentation. This would no doubt create red flags, digital records, and to be compiled on American travelers. My amendment basically recognizes that, signage, no problem, the public awareness program of such a thing to help Americans recall, those of us that carry weapons all the time. If you have this backpack, maybe you had it at the range last week and you're flying now. Signage in the airport parking lots and throughout the airport more extensively than now, no problem. But my amendment strips the rest of the language that would indeed restrict the rights and freedoms of American citizens. So If my colleagues in the majority want to pass this bill through markup today after just 48 hours or so of consideration and a great deal of controversial debate, then by all means do so. But it'll be challenged vigorously on the floor, and the American people will know that this happened this day. So I ask, my amendment recognizes the positive nature of the bill regarding signage and public awareness, but strips the controversial language so that we can move on. And perhaps another bill could be introduced where my colleagues across the aisle could seek to what they refer to as codify the bureaucratic actions of TSA to American travelers. But this is not the bill that's going to move through markup without significant debate and opposition. So I respectfully submit my amendment, and I encourage my colleagues to support it.
Would the gentleman yield his unused
I
time?
yield to my colleague.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the amendment, and I intend to support the amendment. I thought that I would make just one point, which is, if this is codifying administrative practice, it may be that administrative practice needs some reform. But it certainly wouldn't suit to uncritically codify, make permanent, set into law administrative practice that's not been adequately examined. And with all due respect to the chairman, the answer that, well, we're sort of starting the process over here in Congress, and there's going to be a rulemaking by which the bureaucrats are going to determine the law. That, unfortunately, is something we do in Congress far too often. If it is not possible for us to write down in this bill what egregious is and set standards, then the bill's not ready for prime time. And it is no comfort to say that we're going to turn it over to a bureaucrat to propose a rule, go through the comment process, and then do what they want to. That's not the way law is supposed to be made, certainly on a subject as near and dear as a fundamental constitutional right. With that, I yield back. Thanks.
Gentleman's time has expired. Chair recognizes gentlelady from New York, Ms. Rice, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let's be clear. This amendment would give a free pass to passengers who deliberately or repeatedly jeopardize aviation security and break the law. According to TSA, most people who are caught with guns at checkpoints are in fact first-time offenders who did so unwillingly. In response, HR 6856 focuses on helping law-abiding gun owners follow the law and increasing deterrence for the small number of individuals who simply engage in behavior that puts the flying public at risk. Notably, HR 6856 would not increase fines on first-time offenders who honestly forgot a gun in their bag. It only enhances enforcement in a few very limited but extremely serious situations, such as when a passenger deliberately tries to bring a gun on board a plane in their carry-on. We're talking about offenders who didn't simply forget their gun. We're talking about people who actively try to subvert the law and already face criminal prosecution under existing law. Similarly, under HR 6856, anyone repeatedly caught by TSA with a gun at a checkpoint or caught with a firearm that is exceptionally dangerous would be subject to a minimum civil penalty. And by exceptionally dangerous, we mean unique situations such as bringing AK-47s, sawed-off shotguns, 3D printed firearms, and the like to checkpoints. I mean, I don't think anyone believes that you just simply forget that you have an AK-47 in your bag. I would note that TSA already increases penalties for repeat offenders based on aggravating factors. This bill simply reinforces that. Further, this amendment seeks to eliminate the bill's requirement that TSA suspend pre-check for travelers who bring guns to checkpoints. For the record, the provision that the amendment seeks to strike simply codifies TSA's sensible, longstanding policy of suspending access to expedited screening for individuals whose actions indicate that they are not low risk. As such, enactment of this amendment would upend TSA's efforts to protect sterile areas and airplanes from known risks. Pre-check is a privilege for certain low-risk travelers. It's just common sense that if you bring a firearm to a checkpoint, you shouldn't enjoy the benefits of an expedited, less rigorous screening process. You should face the traditional regular screening that most passengers experience. At our recent hearing on firearms at checkpoints, we heard from law enforcement about the importance of TSA's enforcement efforts. Adoption of this amendment would be a slap in the face to the TSOs, the police officers, and others who work tirelessly to combat the surge in firearms at checkpoints. In fact, this amendment even strikes the bill's reporting requirements. For the life of me, I cannot understand why it is apparently controversial to require TSA to provide Congress with information about its implementation of this legislation. I, for one, believe that oversight is essential to having effective and efficient government. I urge my colleagues to reject this dangerous amendment and support the underlying bill. I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
Gentlelady yields back.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Georgia is recognized for speaking on the amendment.
Yes.
Speaking on the amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to speak in support of this amendment. I think this amendment is good legislation. It keeps the discretion for penalties at the TSA level and does not make things mandatory. This particular amendment eliminates Section 4 through 8 of the bill, which it needs to go away. Section 4 starts fines, minimum civil monetary penalties for certain firearm-related violations. If that doesn't mean mandatory, I don't know what is. Sections 1 through 3, I think, are fine. I have no issue with them. I think that's probably a very good thing that we increase the signage, increase awareness, have a public awareness campaign to help people or to remind people that carrying firearms on an aircraft is illegal and that there are penalties for that and that they'll lose their firearm. And no one wants that. No one wants someone who has done something by mistake to suffer a penalty that doesn't that simply doesn't match the actual offense. So and I point back to this to the section in the bill that talks about a payment plan. The penalties are so severe that the bill offers a payment plan. And that just tells you that the penalties are inappropriate. And codifying them is inappropriate. So I applaud my colleague on this amendment, and I would encourage every solitary member to support this amendment. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. If there's no further debate, the question on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Louisiana. Those in favor say aye.
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 The opposed is no. No.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the noes have it, and the amendment is not agreed to.
Roll call vote, Mr. Chairman.
A recorded vote is requested pursuant to Committee Rule 7C. Further proceedings on this question are postponed. It is now in order to consider the amendment on the roster offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez. The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 offered by Mr. Jimenez.
Without objection, the amendment will be considered read. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida for 5 minutes.
Watson Coleman. For bill, the Securing Air Travel Act would put in statute what TSA has been doing to prohibit passengers from bringing firearms into security checkpoints and on aircraft. My amendment would allow TSA to take the funds they receive from firearm civil penalties and use those funds to purchase screening technology at airport checkpoints. I travel through my home airport of Miami often, and given its large size, Miami has the most up-to-date technology. I'd like to see this advanced technology like computed tomography and other screening equipment at all airport checkpoints nationwide. The evolving terrorist threat is too significant to keep obsolete screening equipment in place. Continued investment in technology is key to keeping our nation's airports safe and secure for the traveling public. And thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will yield back.
Is there any further discussion on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez? If there's no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez. Chair recognizes the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I apologize for that. I was trying to balance two things at once and wasn't successful. Look, I've heard all the arguments, and I really respect all the arguments on all sides, and I appreciate the professional manner in which the arguments have been propounded on this issue. I understand this issue comes with some passion, and I understand that individuals have different views. And I just want to give a couple of perspectives from my standpoint. Number one, I'm a very ardent Second Amendment supporter. I own multiple firearms, and I routinely support the Second Amendment in every way, shape, and form. And I understand that it is a constitutional right. But I also understand that my time on Homeland Security has shaped my opinion with respect to airport security in a very serious way. And when I first came on the committee, there were, since the time I came on the committee, I was working on TSA matters, first as chair of the TSA subcommittee for 4 years. And in that time, the number of guns seized at airports has increased dramatically. The number of individuals bringing guns in airports has increased dramatically. And I understand and credit the fact that more people are carrying guns out of fear and what have you, as do I, because of many, many, many threats that I've received. But I have to balance that against the fact that there's an increasing level of violence on airplanes that is deeply troubling, and there's an increasing level of disregard for rules and disregard for law. And I'm particularly troubled with an individual who gets caught with a gun at an airport and then gets caught again, or gets caught again. And to me, that is something that we have to do. So in my mind, and I know many of my colleagues do not agree with me, we have to balance those two things. And it's not easy. It's not easy. I will note that from a state of mind standpoint, I've heard a lot of the arguments about forgot. I forgot to have my gun. Well, TSA has not referred the vast majority of these cases for criminal prosecution for that very reason. So they are using their discretion in a positive manner. And it is why the vast majority of these cases have not been referred. Also, if you forgot to stop at a stoplight, but then you proceed through a stoplight and plow into somebody, you're liable for civil damages for your actions. So even though you forgot, there's still some sort of liability under the law, right? So with that as a background, I just want to say that I am incredibly concerned about the rise in number of firearms that travelers are bringing to airport checkpoints. I appreciate that the majority supports Mr. Jimenez's amendment that will allow TSA to reinvest the civil penalty amounts for repeat violations in order to purchase more screening technology at airport checkpoints. Investing in technology is a critical part of the solution to detecting threat items at the checkpoint. Last year, TSA officers detected 5,972 firearms at airport checkpoints, the highest level in TSA history, with 86% of these firearms being loaded. And I will note, as a gun owner and a concealed carry owner and everything else, we have a duty and responsibility. And every time we abrogate that duty by being irresponsible, it reflects poorly on the people like me and you and all of you here who are lawful and good gun owners. So TSA needs advanced technology to continue to keep our aviation system secure, which is why I'm so pleased to see that my Securing the Checkpoint Property Screening System Act on the roster today. With the rise in violent passengers on flights and the record number of firearms being brought to airports each year, computer tomography and other next-generation screening technologies will help TSA officers find firearms and other prohibited items at airport checkpoints nationwide. Bringing firearms to airport checkpoints puts other passengers, TSA officers, airport workers, and airline staff at serious risk. In addition to the serious risks, firearms at checkpoints can have major economic as well, as we saw in November with a gun discharge that shut down Atlanta Airport for hours over the busy Thanksgiving travel period. I remain concerned with this issue and will continue looking at other solutions like technology and greater law enforcement presence at the checkpoint. I support the Securing Air Travel Act and will continue to push this committee to work in a bipartisan manner to find solutions to this and other security challenges. And before I conclude, I will note to my colleagues, no, you're disappointing me. I'm sure you are, and I understand that. But I have been on this committee for a long time, and I see the risks, and I've been here a lot longer than a lot of you, and I see the vulnerabilities in our air traffic system, and so do the bad guys. And if they see this continuing, the bad guys are going to try again and again. And there's no chance that a gun hasn't gotten through already. And that's one of my biggest concerns. The greatest fear I have is somebody pulling out a gun on an airplane, and we have to balance that against Second Amendment rights. I think this bill does the best it can in that regard. It's not perfect, but I will support it. Now you'll back.
Gentleman yields back. As there's no further debate, the question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Jimenez. Those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the amendment is agreed to. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the measure? Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings on H.R. 6856 are postponed. Without objection, I call up H.R. 6873, H.R. 6824, H.R. 6868 to be considered en bloc. The clerk shall designate bills en bloc.
H.R. 6873, H.R. 6824, H.R. 6868.
Without objection, the first reading of the bills is dispensed with. The bills are circulated in advance and printed copies are available. The chair understands the amendments printed in the circulated roster have been agreed to by the members. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? If not, then without objection, the amendments listed on the roster are considered offered, read, and agreed to en bloc. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver, for a motion. The question is on favorably reporting the bills to the House as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
No.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the bills shall be favorably reported to the House as amended. Without objection,
I request a recorded vote.
a request for a recorded vote is requested. Pursuant to the Committee Rule 7C, further proceedings are postponed. Without objection, I call up H.R. 6826, H.R. 6827, H.R. 6871, H.R. 6861, and H.R. 6837 to be considered en bloc. The clerk shall designate the bills en bloc.
H.R. 6826, H.R. 6827, H.R. 6837, H.R. 6861, H.R. 6871.
Without objection, the first reading of the bills is dispensed with. The bills are circulated in advance and printed copies are available. No amendments to these bills were pre-filed with the clerk. Are there any additional amendments to any of these bills? If not, I recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Correa, for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I move the committee to favorably report the bills H.R. 6826, H.R. 6827, H.R. 6871, H.R. 6861, and H.R. 6837 en bloc to the House without amendments.
The question is on favorably reporting the bills to the House without amendment. Those in favor say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. In opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. The motion is agreed to, and the bills shall be favorably reported to the House without amendment. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The chair will recognize members to speak on their bills following the completion of consideration of today's measures. Pursuant to today's order, the chair will call a recess and will be recalled at a later date.
Mr. Chairman, could I make a parliamentary or an inquiry of the chair? Did you say we're recessing the hearing and we're going to resume at a later date? Oh, I heard a date. So at some later time today or in just a few minutes?
Pursuant to Committee Rule 7C, proceedings will now resume on questions previously postponed in the following order. The amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 offered by Mr. Higgins of Louisiana, the motion to favorably report H.R. 6856 as amended, if ordered, and the motion to favorably report bills as amended en bloc offered by Mr. Cleaver of Missouri. The unfinished business is the demand for a recorded vote on the amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute offered by the gentleman from Louisiana, on which the noes prevail by voice vote. The clerk will redesignate the amendment.
Amendment to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 offered by Mr. Higgins.
A recorded vote has been demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee. Mr. Langevin.
Langevin votes no.
Mr. Langevin votes no. Mr. Payne.
Mr. Payne votes no.
Mr. Payne votes no. Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes no. Ms. Slotkin.
No.
Ms. Slotkin votes no. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes no. Mr. Green.
Green votes no.
Mr. Green votes no. Ms. Clark. Mr. Swalwell.
No.
Mr. Swalwell votes no. Ms. Titus.
Titus votes no.
Ms. Titus votes no. Mrs. Watson Coleman.
No.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes no. Ms. Rice.
Rice votes no.
Ms. Rice votes no. Mrs. Demings.
No.
Mrs. Demings votes no. Ms. Barragan.
Barragan votes no.
Ms. Barragan votes no. Mr. Gottheimer.
No.
Mr. Gottheimer votes no. Mrs. Luria.
No.
Mrs. Luria votes no. Mr. Malinowski.
No.
Mr. Malinowski votes no. Mr. Torres.
No.
Mr. Torres votes no. Mr. Katko.
Yes.
Mr. Katko votes yes. Mr. McCall.
Aye.
Mr. McCall votes aye. Mr. Higgins.
Yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop.
Yes.
Mr. Bishop votes yes. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes yes.
Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Norman. Mrs. Miller Meeks.
Miller Meeks, yes.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes yes. Mrs. Harshbarger.
Harshbarger votes yes.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes yes. Mr. Clyde.
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner.
Turner votes aye.
Mr. LaTurner votes aye. Mr. Meyer. Mrs. Kamak.
Kamak votes aye.
Mrs. Kamak votes aye. Mr. Pfluger. Mr. Garbarino.
Garbarino, yes.
Mr. Garbarino votes yes. Miss Jackson Lee.
Am I unmuted? Hello?
Miss Jackson Lee.
Are you calling on me? Hello? Can you hear me?
Gentlewoman is recognized. I think she's having some technical difficulties.
Miss Clark.
Ms. Clark, Ms. Clark, vote.
Miss Clark votes no. Mr. Norman.
Norman votes.
Mr. Norman votes yes.
Jackson Lee votes no.
Miss Jackson Lee votes no. Mr. Meyer. Mr. Pfluger.
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote? How's the chair
You are not
recorded?
recorded.
Chair votes no.
Mr. Thompson votes no.
The clerk will report the vote.
Mr. Chairman, on that vote, there were 14 yeas, 19 noes.
The amendment is not agreed to. There are no further amendments listed on the roster. Are there any further amendments to the measure? If not, the question on agreeing to the amendment in the nature of a substitute to H.R. 6856 as amended. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no.
Aye.
In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it. An amendment in the nature of a substitute is agreed to. The question now occurs on reporting the bill, H.R. 6856, as amended to the House with a favorable recommendation. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chairs, the ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to.
Mr. Chairman, request a recorded vote.
A recorded vote has been demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Miss Jackson Lee.
That there's a baby's life is in the hands of the British public.
Mhm. Yeah.
Say, no, you.
Mr. Langevin.
Langevin votes aye.
Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Payne.
I know she's smart enough to learn because she was good at high school.
What do we do here? Mr. Correa. Mr. Correa votes aye. Miss Slotkin.
Aye.
Miss Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Cleaver. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green.
Green votes yay.
Mr. Green votes yay. Miss Clark.
Ms. Clark,
Miss Clark votes aye. Mr. Swalwell.
Aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Miss Titus.
Titus votes aye.
Miss Titus votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman.
Watson Coleman votes aye.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Miss Rice.
Rice votes aye.
Miss Rice votes aye. Mrs. Demings.
Aye.
Thank you.
Mrs. Demings votes aye. Miss Barragan.
I think are on the same page. And
Members are reminded to mute their mics.
Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mrs. Luria. Aye. Mrs. Luria votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Torres. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall.
McCall votes no.
Mr. McCall votes no. Mr. Higgins.
Mr. Higgins.
He voted no.
He voted no.
Mr. Higgins?
He voted no.
Votes no. Mr. Guest? Mr. Guest votes no. Mr. Bishop? Mr. Bishop votes no. Mr. Van Drew?
Excuse me, how am I recorded?
Mr. Van Drew votes no.
Lady is not in order. Clerk will continue calling the roll.
Mr. Van Drew votes no. Mr. Norman?
Norman votes no.
Mr. Norman votes no. Mrs. Miller Meeks?
Miller Meeks, no.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes no. Mrs. Harshbarger?
Harshbarger votes no.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes no. Mr. Clyde?
No.
Mr. Clyde votes no. Mr. Jimenez?
Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner? Mr. Meyer? Mrs. Kamak?
Kamak votes no.
Mrs. Kamak votes no. Mr. Pfluger?
How's Ms. Jackson Lee recorded? Oh,
Gentlelady is not recorded. She missed an earlier vote. We'll get back to you shortly. Clerk will continue to call the roll.
Mr. Garbarino?
Garbarino, no.
Mr. Garbarino votes no. Ms. Jackson Lee?
aye.
Ms. Jackson Lee votes aye. Mr. Payne?
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Ms. Barragan?
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Torres?
Torres votes aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. LaTurner?
Mr. LaTurner votes no.
Mr. LaTurner votes no. Mr. Meyer? Mr. Pfluger?
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote? How is the chair recorded?
You are not recorded.
Chair votes yes.
Chairman Thompson votes yes.
The clerk will report the vote.
Chairman Thompson, on that vote, there were 21 yeas, 12 noes.
The motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. The unfinished business is the demand for a recorded vote on the motion to favorably report bills as amended en bloc offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver. A recorded vote has been demanded. The clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Jackson Lee? Mr. Langevin?
Langevin votes aye.
Mr. Langevin votes aye. Mr. Payne?
Mr. Payne votes aye.
Mr. Payne votes aye. Mr. Correa? Aye. Mr. Correa votes aye. Ms. Slotkin?
Aye.
Ms. Slotkin votes aye. Mr. Cleaver? Aye. Mr. Cleaver votes aye. Mr. Green?
Green votes yay.
Mr. Green votes yay. Ms. Clark?
I think Ms. Clark is having some difficulty.
Mr.
Ms.
Swalwell?
Clark votes aye.
Ms. Clark votes aye.
Swalwell is aye.
Mr.
Swalwell's aye.
Mr. Swalwell votes aye. Ms. Titus?
Titus votes aye.
Ms. Titus votes aye. Mrs. Watson Coleman?
Aye.
Mrs. Watson Coleman votes aye. Ms. Rice?
Rice votes aye.
Ms. Rice votes aye. Mrs. Demings?
Ms. Demmings votes aye.
Mrs. Demmings votes aye. Ms. Barragan.
Barragan votes aye.
Ms. Barragan votes aye. Mr. Gottheimer.
Gottheimer votes aye.
Mr. Gottheimer votes aye. Mrs. Luria.
Aye.
Mrs. Luria votes aye. Mr. Malinowski.
Aye.
Mr. Malinowski votes aye. Mr. Torres.
Aye.
Mr. Torres votes aye. Mr. Katko.
Mr. Katko votes aye.
Mr. Katko votes aye. Mr. McCall. Mr. Higgins.
Higgins votes yes.
Mr. Higgins votes yes. Mr. Guest. Mr. Guest votes aye. Mr. Bishop. Mr. Bishop votes yes. Mr. Van Drew.
Mr. Van Drew votes yes.
Mr. Van Drew votes yes. Mr. Norman.
Higgins, Guest, Bishop, all yes.
Yes.
Mr. Norman votes yes. Mrs. Miller Meeks.
Miller Meeks, yes.
Mrs. Miller Meeks votes yes. Mrs. Harshbarger.
Harshbarger votes yes.
Mrs. Harshbarger votes yes. Mr. Clyde.
Yes.
Mr. Clyde votes yes. Mr. Jimenez.
Jimenez votes yes.
Mr. Jimenez votes yes. Mr. LaTurner.
Turner votes yes.
Mr. LaTurner votes yes. Mr. Meyer.
Meyer votes yes.
Mr. Meyer votes yes. Mrs. Kamak.
Kamak votes yes.
Mrs. Kamak votes yes. Mr. Pfluger.
Pfluger votes aye.
Mr. Pfluger votes aye. Mr. Garbarino.
Garbarino, yes.
Mr. Garbarino votes yes. Miss Jackson Lee. Mr. McCall.
Is there any other member wishing to vote or wishing to change his or her vote? How is the chair recorded?
You are not recorded.
Chair votes yes.
Chairman Thompson votes yes.
The clerk will
Mr.
report.
Chair,
Gentleman from New Jersey.
am I recorded, sir?
How is Congressman Payne recorded?
As a yay.
You're recorded yes.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
The clerk will report the vote.
Chairman Thompson, on that vote, there were 33 yeas, 0 noes.
The motion is agreed to. Without objection, a motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. Without objection, staff is authorized to make any required technical or conforming changes to reflect the actions of the committee. Without objection, the measures amended during today's markup will be reported to the House in the form of one amendment in the nature of a substitute for each bill. Members may now be recognized to speak on their legislation previously considered. Hearing none, this concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for today.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Due to technical difficulties on the first 2 votes, I was unable to join the hearing by WebEx, but I would like it recorded that I would have been a yes on Higgins and a no on the Watson-Coleman bills. Thank you. I yield back.
Let me have my poll.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the ranking member. A gentleman from Louisiana seek time.
I did not request to be recognized, Mr. Chairman, but thank you.
Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman.
Gentlelady from Texas.
Mr. Chairman, thank you, Mr. Chairman, for recognizing me. Is this the appropriate time to briefly comment on the amendments that we have submitted?
Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I rise to discuss several amendments that I've offered on important legislation, in particular HR 1540, reporting efficiently to proper officials in response to Terrorism Act of 2021. And I've offered an amendment that directs the House Committee on the Judiciary and the Permanent Select Committee on Intelligence will be included in the reporting requirements under the bill. And in the Senate, the Committees on Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs, Judiciary, and the Select Committee on Intelligence will be included as well. This bill requires the DHS Secretary, in coordination with the Attorney General, Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, and as appropriate, the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, to submit to Congress an unclassified report, which may include a classified annex within 1 year of the completion of an investigation of act of terrorism. As we have done in this committee through our creation of the joint fusion centers, I believe it is important for relevant officials and committees to ensure the continuity of response and oversight. And I thank you for supporting the Jackson Lee Amendment. It designates which oversight committees will the report be mandated to by the bill. I have an amendment to HR 6868, and that amendment in particular creates a reporting requirement on how grants or cooperative agreements are being used to enhance cybersecurity education for underserved populations or communities. I think clearly the cybersecurity depth or lack of is well known amongst vulnerable communities. This is a serious and growing threat to cybersecurity in terms of the intrusion on hacking, and it would be important to include consideration of those communities. I have an amendment as well to HR 6873, the Bombing Prevention Act of 2022. And that amendment in particular directs the Secretary of Homeland Security to work with the heads of other federal agencies to make sure that the work of the Office of Bombing Prevention aligns with the threat environment, and to make the public and private sectors aware of the office and its capabilities. As you well know, we've had a briefing on the bomb threats to HBCUs, minority serving institutions, and places of worship. This is an important initiative, and I think the idea of the Jackson Lee Amendment is to make sure that the heads of other federal agencies are informed, to make sure that the work of the Office for Bombing Prevention aligns with the enormity of threats that are continuing to impact our community. With that, I ask my entire statement to be submitted into the record. I ask unanimous consent. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman. Ask unanimous consent for the document to be submitted into the record.
Without objection, gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from Georgia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Katko, for allowing this important piece of legislation, HR 6861, the Reducing Costs of DHS Acquisitions Act, to come before the committee. This bill amends the Homeland Security Act of 2002 to provide for greater oversight of major acquisition programs within the Department of Homeland Security. Major acquisition programs, by definition, are ones that cost over $300 million, many of which are projected to cost over $1 billion. This bill requires the program manager within the department to report to the DHS Undersecretary for Management and to Congress, this committee specifically, on major acquisition programs that have gone over budget, realized scheduled delays, or have not met their established performance requirements. Having this type of information in a timely manner is critical for Congress oversight of the department. These acquisitions include critical programs from Homeland Security, such as CISA's National Security Cybersecurity Protection System, the Coast Guard's Offshore Patrol Cutter, and CBP's Biometric Entry-Exit Program. This is just a small sample of the many DHS major acquisition programs that must be well managed, so the department and its employees can acquire what they need to meet their missions. I believe most of us realize that in some cases, cost increase in a program is warranted in order to develop needed Homeland Security capabilities. For example, CISA's National Cybersecurity Protection System is intended to defend government systems from cyber threats by providing intrusion detection analytic capabilities. This program established its original requirements in 2009, 13 years ago. Since then, the system's users' processes have changed, and the threats to our systems have evolved significantly. As a result, the program declared a scheduled breach in January 2020 to update its requirements to meet users' needs and mitigate these threats. Currently, the program's estimated cost is just under $6.4 billion. But even this estimate may be expected to increase to account for the continued updating of requirements. Given the significant level of investment in this key Homeland Security program, it is essential that Congress be kept appraised of the program's progress, and this bill will do just that. In some cases, a program's cost increased or schedule delays are the result of not adhering to acquisition best practices and DHS policies, or not addressing risks to the program. Program managers and DHS leaders also need to be held accountable in these instances, and that is what this bill does. It helps DHS in its efforts to improve management of its major acquisition programs by ensuring that program managers use best practices, and if things go off the rails, that breaches are reported in a timely manner. If a breach occurs, the bill requires the program manager to report it to the head of the relevant component and the component acquisition executive. That is, the DHS official responsible for ensuring that statutory, regulatory, and acquisition policy requirements are followed, and to the executive director of the program, Accountability and Risk Management Office. Once notification takes place, the program must pause all activities except those necessary to develop a remediation plan. And until the plan is approved or alternative corrective actions are taken, including canceling of the program. Finally, the bill requires DHS to notify Congress describing the corrective actions with a justification for each. At a time when the department is facing unprecedented threats on multiple fronts to our nation's security, it is more critical than ever for DHS to efficiently and effectively purchase what it needs to defend our country from attack. Thank you, and I urge the committee to vote yes on this bill.
Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Payne, to speak on his amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to speak on my bill, HR 6387, School and Daycare Protection Act. Mr. Chairman, over 2 decades have passed since the horrendous shooting at Columbine High School in Littleton, Colorado, where 13 people tragically lost their lives. Sadly, schools continue to be targeted for shooting. In 2012, a lone gunman killed 20 children and 6 adults at Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Then in 2018, there was the Marjorie Stoneman Douglas High School shooting that claimed the lives of 17 individuals. For its part, DHS has come to view school security as a homeland security concern, and today, a diverse range of components from across the department have school and campus security responsibilities. My bill seeks to ensure coordination among those components. It does so by establishing a standing council within DHS to coordinate school security activities, plans, and policies. My amendment, in the nature of a substitute, improves on the underlying bill by authorizing DHS to participate in the government-wide schoolsafety.gov clearinghouse and increasing transparency and accountability to Congress regarding DHS efforts in this space. Lastly, I would like to thank Chairman Thompson, Ranking Member Katko, and my fellow committee members for their continued support of my bill. An earlier version of this legislation was advanced by the committee last Congress and was approved by the full House. Here's hoping that we get my legislation to the president's desk this time around. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentlemen yields back. This concludes the consideration of the bills noticed by the committee for the day.
Mr. Chairman, pursuant to House Rule 11, Clause 2L, I ask that members have 2 calendar days to file with the clerk of the committee supplemental, additional, or minority views on each of the bills ordered reported by the committee today. I yield back.
So ordered. There being no further business before the committee, without objection, the committee stands adjourned.